Okay, Michael Jordan, thank you so much for joining me. How are you doing today?
Doing really well. Happy to be here, Mike.
It's very exciting to talk to you. We've been friends for a while, but never gotten to sit down and do one of these. So first, maybe you can just introduce yourself to everybody. Where do you live and what sort of test prep do you do?
Yeah, so I'm in Carrollton, Texas, which is just north of Dallas in the DFW Metroplex. I've been here for, about 10 years. Started test prep business back in 2014. My background is in music education. My degree was music ed from University of North Texas, and then I taught high school band for a few years. I had a just natural exit from that in 2013, worked for a couple test prep companies, kind of learned what they did, and then was strongly urged by my clientele to branch out on my own and explore what I could do on my own. So started business back in 2014, partially because of my music background as a music director and pursuing a new direction. I named business Direction Tutors, but quickly realized that nobody actually called us Direction Tutors. They just called us Michael Jordan's Company, blessing and curse of my name. So we rebranded in 2016, but back in 2014, just started as a solo shop and made very little money trying to, grind it out on my own. Now we have a team it fluctuates between 10 and 12, just as far as, seasonal availability. We do 100% one-on-one tutoring. We don't do groups, never have. About 90% of what we do is in person, which is a little bit unique. There aren't that many companies here in DFW that are doing in person, let alone in-home, which again is about 90% of what we do. Right now, we just tutor ACT and SAT. We don't do any academic or other tests at this time, although we're definitely looking to expand in future years. And just as far as product mix goes, and this is just what we found, with our students at the schools that we work with, about 80% ACT and about 20% SAT. But of course, we'll see how that changes over the next couple of years with upcoming changes.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So you're mostly in home and you do longer sessions, right? Are they 2 hours?
We do 2-hour sessions. Yeah. And part of that is just the nature of doing in home, that we have, the natural overhead of travel. And so it just makes better sense to spread that out and do 2-hour sessions instead of meeting once a week. Early on, I did a lot of experimenting with 1 hour, hour and a half versus 2-hour sessions, and really found that just our style of tutoring, while we're working in person with a student, 2 hours really is kind of the optimal amount to be able to get through past stuff, get through homework, review, go over that content, make tweaks. Usually we take a 2-minute Snapchat break halfway through, and then second half is typically focused on new material and looking forward.
Interesting. Yeah, I was going to say, if it's that length of session, then in a way it might be more similar to a music lesson where maybe the student has rehearsed 3 or 4 piano pieces during the week and you want to hear what they did, but then there's a significant period of the time where the student's actually playing for you and you're observing them playing and then giving feedback and then doing it again. Is that kind of how you do it? Like you have them read a passage in front of you or do 10 math questions in front of you and just sort of observe how they handle it?
So interestingly, we operate on what some educators call the feedback model, where and I think why 2-hour sessions work for us is I don't have any tolerance for dead time during sessions. So at no time during any of our sessions is there just absolute silence, unless a student is actually reading through a reading passage. But otherwise in session, if we're working through material, it's a conversation 100% of the time. So I never have a student, just work 10 questions on their own and then get back to me, or, hey, do this reading passage and then let's check it. To me, that's the purvey of homework. But in session, the feedback model is I want to guide the student through every single step of every single question where they're not allowed to make a single mistake. And I'm guiding their process the whole time. And so just giving them the, ultimate 100% right way of how I would want to handle that question Then when they go do homework, they get to repeat that and do it the right way. So rather than just, a shotgun approach of let's do a bunch of stuff and see what sticks, we try to be really prescriptive about going through every single step of every single question.
That makes sense. So going to math, like, do you have a philosophy behind why kids improve? Like, I mean, if someone has a 25 on the ACT and then they work with you for a while and they get a 32, many respects, they're the same person that they were when they had the 25, but in some ways they're better at math, at least. Like, what is it that's happened in between those 2 points to make them achieve those higher scores?
Man, that's a great question. I think there's a lot that goes into it, and I probably couldn't nail every bullet point of it, but a lot of the things that we focus on are systematic processes. My goal for every student is when they go take their test, and this is true for all the sections, but especially for math, I think, even though when they take their test, yes, every question on that test is going to be unseen. Every question is going to be new to them. My goal is that none of the questions feel new to them.
Yeah.
So what I love, in all sections, is if a student comes back to me after a test and says, yeah, I mean, it just felt familiar. Well, that's the goal. That means that I've done my job. And so my goal is teaching them systematic processes of question identification, picking up clues and triggers in questions that just so they see it and go, oh, it's one of these. Here's step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, whatever it might be. And just creating those habits and just creating a really stable process for students. And so part of that in math, one of the things that we start with is just the system of question reading, how to read a question. One of the things that I'll often start with, regardless of student level, is just reading math questions by punctuation, essentially. So anytime they hit punctuation in a question, stop and ask, is there anything I can do? And so if they hit a period, look at the previous sentence and go, hey, is there anything that I can write down? Is there anything that I can put down? I also coach students that sometimes you read that sentence and you get a little piece of the question. You ultimately don't know where that's going. Right. That's okay. You don't have to have the end in sight to get step 1. And a lot of my students who have a little bit of math paralysis want to figure out every step of the question before they even start. And so I think taking that bit by bit punctuation approach just helps them take things in bite-sized pieces. And then once they've established all those bite-sized pieces, then figuring out, what do I do with this? I've got all the ingredients. Now, what's the recipe? What am I trying to make here? Yeah. So that's one. So, question reading is one. Error prevention is another. I'm big on, especially when it comes to homework mistakes, really isolating the cause of the mistake, whether that's a content mistake, whether it's a reading mistake, whether it's a process mistake, or just an oops, and just being aware of those oopses and minimizing those, is a huge boon for students. The other, especially, like you said, if we're trying to get from a 25 to a 32, I think one thing that's super helpful for students is what I term answer awareness. And answer awareness is just scanning your answers and seeing what's there. Simple things. Is it a fraction? Does it have pi? Does it have a radical? Is it in degrees? All those sorts of things. That helps a student, even before they start to work a question, mentally set, a finish line of what we're trying to get to. Right. That helps prevent, overworking questions, underworking questions, doing unnecessary steps, and essentially they know when they can stop.
Yep, that all makes sense. So what made you interested in Mathchops, given that philosophy and your approach to math? Like, how did you think it could help you?
Yeah, so it took some practice on my own, really, to get it. I think Mathchops is simultaneously really self-explanatory, but also needs some exploration, tutors part. And I know you get that. So I was first introduced to Mathchops. I'm not big on Reddit like a lot of others are. So I didn't know about Mathchops until the first NTPA conference. And, saw you give a presentation, not about Mathchops, and then, introduce Mathchops to, those of us there. Started the generous free trial on my own just to do some exploring. And a couple things I found. One, it's interesting because I just talked about, answer awareness, and yet Mathchops isn't multiple choice. It's
Right.
all free response, right? It's all
Yeah.
student produced response. But what I found is that helps to emphasize the processing part of things and not trying to cheat questions. It really helps students be systematic of recognizing what kind of question it is and then setting up their steps sequentially, to get from start to finish.
Mhm.
I think the timer right in front of a student is huge, and that's not something that we necessarily have. Occasionally, towards the end of a program, if I'm trying to tweak timing in a session, I'll turn on a stopwatch and use lap timer to see how much time a student's spending per question. Well, when they're doing it on their own inside Mathchops, they have that right I mean, it's just screaming at them, for better
Right.
or worse. And that helps me as a tutor. That helps tweak a whole lot of things. One, from silly error prevention. I
Mhm.
was just working with a student, a wonderful student yesterday, and she was missing a bunch of questions. We were doing some Mathchops together. She was
Mhm.
missing a bunch of questions, but had 45 seconds on the clock. And
Mm.
that just brought up a discussion of, why is this? What do we need to tweak? What mental aspects do we need to tweak, just so you go take another pass at this and try to find your mistakes. Obviously, it'd be great if she could, get those on the first run. But if she has
Yeah.
45 seconds, do a second run, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Right. And she'll get it eventually, after a
Right.
while. You start, to your point earlier, there are a lot of patterns. You start to recognize the patterns and you pick your process for that pattern and you implement it. So how do you normally assign it to students, or what's the normal flow? How does it fit in with everything else that you're doing?
Yeah. So our normal program length is, and again, it varies, but kind of our average program length is a 6 to 8 week lead up before a test. So
Mm.
6 to 8 2-hour sessions, so 12 to 16 hours. Normally the rhythm that I use with a student, we typically introduce Mathchops in the first session. The first level challenge is untimed, so I just get to explain the process to them of how many lives, how many questions, how to star. I show them on my end, how I can see the questions that they've completed and the stars that they've, flagged questions. So I just kind of show both sides of it through that first level challenge.
Mhm.
And then typically, for a first session of homework or first set of homework, I'll just give them the assignment of level up as high as you can. Oftentimes I will give them a goal of, X plus, and usually that's based on their diagnostic test or prior test results. If they scored a 25 on diagnostic, I'll just say, hey, let's get your Mathchops up to that or higher if you can.
Mhm.
For my competitive students, I say, I'll give you a B for a 25, but I'll give you an A for a 27. And then they just want to shoot for that, one level higher.
I
So
like that.
it's kind of the first is let's get up to baseline.
Yeah.
After that, I use a lot of your, prescriptive cycles of how to use Mathchops. Oftentimes, either in session 2 or 3, I'll assign to get all category challenges up to whatever their level is.
Mhm.
I encourage them to try to start right on, let's say that they're on a level 27. I'll encourage them, shoot for that 27. And if you can't, start lower and then work your way up.
Right.
That's just kind of to get categories to a baseline, where I know how they're performing. That helps on the analytics side as well. So when I see that, when I see their bar graph of different categories, I know, and I can see if there's certain areas that we specifically need to work on.
Yep.
Another part of how I assign Mathchops is for students to build their own formula sheets. And so I'll have them, for any questions that they miss, do see explanation. And if there's a formula involved, put it down on their formula sheet. That
Mhm.
helps, without any work on my part, that helps build, a personal customized formula sheet that a student needs to review, because it's essentially the, only the things that they've missed. We're not
Yep.
wasting time on things that they already know, that they've already memorized, that they're already successful with. We just get to focus on the things that they need, which I think is one of the most, core essential pieces of Mathchops.
For sure. Do you use the starring function in that way too? Like to have them star questions and then there's like a list?
Yeah, I definitely have them star questions. I will say, just by nature, if I assign Mathchops, typically during a 2-hour session, I'll scroll through everything a student has done the prior week and
Yeah.
just spot check anything they missed or ran out of time on,
Yep.
just look at all those reds and yellows. And so I think if I didn't, let's say I didn't have 2-hour sessions, I didn't have the time to do that, I think I would use the starring function more, because
Yeah.
it would really help to focus on exactly that sub list of questions that a student, alerted me to. But
Yep.
since we tend to go through everything anyway, it's not
Right.
quite as important.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then you mentioned earlier that on the one hand, it's self-explanatory, but then it also requires some exploration. I think there are a lot of tutors who maybe feel that way. Could you, if you had some advice for them, like how can they get used to it, or what can they do to get up to speed a little faster?
Yeah. I think number one, using your materials, using Mathchops education materials. I think you've done a great job of putting together material that's useful for tutors, of how they can quickly understand the platform and put it to use. But I think, in test prep, I don't believe that any of us, have anything brand new. There's nothing new under the sun. We're all using the same material, just in different ways and putting our own tweaks on it. And I think that can be true for Mathchops as well. So as a tutor, it was valuable for me to go through the different games, go through the different activities, and fit that into my philosophy of test prep and how we actually do things. So I assign different games or, use them in a session with a student for different reasons. For example, break the bank. How would you define the purpose of break the bank on the Mathchops side? Like, how is that useful to students from your perspective?
Well, it's funny. I mean, the original theory, which proved to not be true, was that we'll just make all these fun games and kids will be engaged by certain ones. And as long as they're being directed towards really high value questions, it doesn't really matter what the format is. It could be break the bank or predict your score or whatever, and they'll be hitting these high value things. So from our point of view, it's like, well, we're putting you through really good questions. And we're also getting some information about how confident you are in your answers based on the different betting level. And so we just kind of thought, well, maybe this will be a format that'll get kids to use it a little bit more. And in fact, most kids just want to see that score. So they want to see that 680 or whatever. So it's my favorite game. I'm not sure it's the favorite of students, but that was the thinking on our end.
So one thing, and like I said, just putting our own spin on the activities that are there. I use Break the Bank, and I love doing it with students and watching them go through it and then coaching them afterwards. I use it almost as a risk assessment tool of how confident they are in two ways. Number one, comparing what they're willing to bet on a question with how much time that they've used. I think that's really valuable to kind of weigh that, that balance of, are they betting it all on a wrong answer when they've only used 10 seconds and have 50 seconds left, something like that.
Yeah.
Versus, I have one student who, and I've had several students like this, who she just wasn't willing to move on from a question unless she was 100% confident. And that just killed her timing. And I noticed on Break the Bank, even if she was 100% confident, she wouldn't bet at all. She would just go for the second or third option. And so that helped me kind of peer into her psychology philosophy of handling questions and helped give her some good advice of what is good enough to be able to circle an answer and move on. How do you know if you're spending too much time on a question? How do you know if you're 100% confident, that you've reached that point of sureness when you're like, yes, I've checked this. I know this is right. She just didn't have that confidence. And I think we helped build that through Break the Bank. Another one would be Diamond Dash, where you have different categories at once. Just like in language, we call it code switching. I think math, there's something analogous just of being able to switch, switch paths in math from going from, a geometry question to an algebra question to a word problem to a, find all the prime factors of 21 through 40, a time set question. And I think Diamond Dash helps with that, quick switching of being able to change lanes and not get stuck in one discipline or the other.
Yep. Yeah, I love that. And I agree with you that Break the Bank is probably the best for an in-session type of work, because in a way, kids aren't as focused on the score, and they're a little bit more free to make mistakes and see that they can
Sure.
still do well, and you miss that question, so what? Like, you can still get right back to that score or win, so um, that's really interesting. Well, this has been great. Do you have any other final thoughts or anything you want to share with people before we go?
One thing that's been just fun for me to watch with students is when we first do Mathchops in session 1, I make sure that their sound is on. And I get them addicted to the ding. And I emphasize the crap out of it. When they first hear that ding, I'm like, oh, do you hear that? What a tasty noise. Isn't that amazing? And they're like, yeah, that's a really cool noise. And the more they hear it, we almost make it, this little act of like, oh my gosh, that is just, oh, that is such a tasty sound.
Yeah,
And even though it's in jest and they know that I'm being a little bit humorous, they end up really enjoying the ding.
yeah,
And it's just that Pavlovian, conditioning that I
yeah,
think is amazing. And really, the ding is a very pleasant ding. But I think in short, getting students engaged in the process, and even if it comes from a place of humor, just getting them to actually enjoy what they're doing and finding those things that are really beneficial or enjoyable, I think that makes the whole process smoother.
that's great. Well, Michael Jordan, thank you so much for joining me. This has been very helpful, and I'll be talking to you soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mike.